It is a rare thing for ancient historical mysteries to ever be fully resolved. Great enigmas like the pyramids of Egypt seem to somehow resist the passage of time, unchanging as it flows around them, like boulders in the river of history. Occasionally, our civilization makes some small incremental progress. A new tomb is found, or some object discovered, destined to become yet another piece in a museum. 12 years ago, in 2008, a momentous discovery was made beneath the sands of Egypt. This discovery wasn't simply some small incremental step, but represented rather a huge leap forward, an opportunity for historical exploration and learning the likes of which we have not witnessed in a century or more. The Great Lost Labyrinth of ancient Egypt had been found. This was a gigantic and mythical structure, said by some to have surpassed the achievement of the pyramids, a huge array of thousands of underground halls, temples, and chambers, dwarfing all known Egyptian temple sites several times over. Not simply just legend, either. This structure was visited and witnessed firsthand by the great historians of millennia past, yet ultimately was lost to the sands of the desert, and its physical presence remained unknown for more than 2,000 years. Unknown, that is, until 12 years ago. Despite this incredible discovery, there has been no global press coverage of it, and very few people are even aware that the mighty labyrinth of legend has indeed been found. The discovery was suppressed, and today the incredible potential of this site is being slowly and irrevocably destroyed by both inaction on the part of the authorities and by the water table in the area that's rising due to agricultural irrigation and the damming of the River Nile. My name is Ben. You're watching Uncharted X, and this is the story of the Great Lost Labyrinth of ancient Egypt, now found. Located roughly 90 kilometers to the south of Cairo, this is Hawara, the location that has long been speculated to be that of the Great Labyrinth. I've visited this site on a couple of different occasions. Compared with Giza or any of the other well-known ancient Egyptian sites, there really isn't a lot to immediately take in. Some fragments of once mighty granite columns, carved in palm or lotus shapes, along with other small fragments of ancient stonework, are left lying in a small open-air museum. The site is dominated by the remains of the pyramid of Amenemhet III, with only the broken down adobe mud brick internal structure remaining to see, although this was once a true pyramid encased in white limestone. The view from the top of the remains of this pyramid shows the other dominating feature of this site, the Bar Wabi Canal. The remains of the labyrinth have been discovered in the sandy areas to the south of the pyramid on both sides of this canal, and presumably underneath it. The first to find any real evidence of this was the great Flinders Petrie, who, in the late 1800s, discovered the remains of a huge stone foundation more than 300 metres broad, in around 4 to 5 metres beneath the sand. He concluded that this was the remnants of the foundations for the labyrinth, with the structure itself being long since quarried and destroyed. However, new evidence collected in our modern times is challenging his conclusion, and it now seems likely that what Petrie found was not the foundation of the labyrinth, but instead was parts of the ceiling or the roof of the labyrinth's upper layers. We suspect this because these same areas were scanned in 2008 using ground-penetrating radar, as well as several other techniques, by the Mataha expedition, a collaboration between Egyptian authorities, the Ghent University of Belgium, and funded by contemporary artist Louis de Cordier. The results of this expedition clearly indicate the presence of grid-like and ordered structures deep beneath the sand in levels much deeper than Petrie ever excavated. Huge walls of materials with a density akin to granite were detected over a wide area on both sides of this canal in depths exceeding 9 metres or around 30 feet beneath the ground. Although this expedition was conducted with the full cooperation and permission of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt, the official results and conclusion of this legitimate scientific study have never been released by the Egyptian authorities, and the expedition team members were deliberately silenced. Before we take a closer look at this expedition and what can be seen today at Hawara, let's first examine the history of this area and that of the labyrinth itself. Known today as Hawara after the nearby village of the same name, this pyramid sits at the entrance to the Fayum oasis, which is a large depression shown here by this green area, with Lake Moeris at its northern edge. The modern-day town of Medinet el Fayum was once known as Crocodilopolis, and also as the ancient town of Arsinoe, with its own rich history of archaeological finds. The depression of the Fayum oasis is connected to the Nile River by channels and canals, and was regularly inundated with Nile water during each wet season. At least this happened before the Nile was dammed up and this seasonal inundation still took place. During the time of the dynastic Egyptians, it would have been an important agricultural zone, much as it still is today. The form of Lake Moeris itself may even be partially man-made. It was the subject of massive engineering projects undertaken by the pharaohs of the early Middle Kingdom. Flinders Petrie, who seemed more engineer than Egyptologist in a lot of ways, spent significant time exploring this area, and he wrote about the Fayum oasis in his 1889 book entitled Hawara, Biamu and Arsinoe. Quoting Petrie from this book, quote, "So many opinions have been broached about Lake Moeris that an account of antiquities in the Fayum without mentioning it would seem impossible. The Fayum is one of the oases of the Libyan desert, lying close to the Nile Valley, and the intervening ground is low enough for the Nile to pour into the basin. The fall from the Nile Valley to where the channel widens out into the Fayum is about 12 feet, and the water flows over the province by canals and ravines, worn through the rock and its superincumbent mud, until the streams finally collect in the Birket Kurun at more than 200 feet below the Nile level, and indeed 130 feet below the sea. In prehistoric times, the Nile Valley was full of water to a far greater depth than at present. Probably 100 or 200 feet deep of water filled it right across. A river of such size seems almost incredible, and we naturally should suppose it to have been an estuary, but this must not be too hastily assumed, as there are evidences over the whole country of an enormous rainfall, which ploughed up the cliffs with great ravines. This prehistoric High Nile is not, however, pre-human, as I found a Paleolithic flint high up on the hills to the west of Esne, clearly river-worn. The geologic conditions, then, in the prehistoric time prove that the Fayum Basin must have been a vast lake, connected by a broad arm with the Nile Valley. As the rainfall ceased and the Nile fell, the neck of water was reduced, but it still sufficed as a channel for the filling of the Fayum, in all probability, in the time of the earliest dynasties. It is pretty well certain that the Fayum Basin continued during the early dynasties to receive the inflow of the Nile as it had done for ages before. This, then, was the state in which the great engineering monarchs of Egypt found the province, a basin full of overflow Nile water, replenished at each inundation through a marshy, shallow inlet, and with much of its bottom so raised by deposits as to have become almost marsh ground, like the present lakes about the coast. Amenemhet III is the earliest king of whom we have any evidence in the Fayum. He appears to have reclaimed the site of the capital, Shed, quote, the separated or extracted, and thus he established, quote, the land of the lake, end quote. The work of Amenemhet III consisted in reclaiming more land and damming back the lake to narrower limits, while improving the canals which led in and out of it, so as to render it more effective in cooperating with the Nile. He thus established Lake Moeris, and his works gave him the credit of being its founder in later ages. End quote. It's interesting to note here Petrie finding evidences for massive flooding and rainfall across the country of Egypt, and I can't help but draw parallels with his work in the 1800s to the modern-day work of Robert Schoch and John Anthony West, who redate the Great Sphinx back into a time of great rainfall. There also seem to be connections here, I think at least, to the great floods and cataclysms of past ages, perhaps even to the Younger Dryas period of 12,800 years ago. A subject for a future video. The Pyramid of Hawara isn't the only thing of note that marks the Fayum. During Petrie's expeditions in the area, he explored many different sites, and he found the remains of several different structures, including one of Egypt's mighty colossi, of which only some small fragments were found, but they were enough to reconstruct the scale and approximate size of the statue. In this case, it would have stood around 50 to 60 feet high, or nearly 20 meters. And of course, this area has long been reported as the home for the gigantic labyrinth, a unique structure amongst all of the glories of ancient Egypt, and there have been several accounts of it over the millennia. These accounts have always placed it at or near the entrance to the Fayum oasis. Although specific details differ, a consistent theme of ancient first-hand accounts of the labyrinth is that it was truly massive, along with being megalithic in construction, made up of a huge arrangement of precision-cut large granite blocks, all of which would have had to be transported north to the labyrinth from Aswan or from elsewhere in Egypt. It was supposed to have contained literally thousands of chambers and rooms, as well as a bewildering number of passages, spread over multiple levels with giant columned halls that were dedicated to the full pantheon of Egyptian gods. The first recorded account we have of this structure outside of Egypt itself comes from Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. Even by this time, the labyrinth was already millennia old, as it is thought to have originated in the early parts of the Middle Kingdom, although I do suspect that its deeper levels and its origins extend far further back than that. In the second book of his history, Herodotus wrote of the labyrinth, quote, "Now they," meaning the 12 kings of Egypt, "determined to leave in common a memorial of themselves, and, having so determined, they built a labyrinth a little above the lake of Moeris, situated near that called the City of Crocodiles. This I have myself seen, and found it greater than can be described. For if anyone should reckon up the buildings and public works of the Grecians, they would be found to have cost less labour and expense than this labyrinth, though the temple in Ephesus is deserving of mention, and also that in Samos. The pyramids, likewise, were beyond description, and each of them comparable to many of the great Grecian structures. Yet the labyrinth surpasses even the pyramids. For it has 12 courts enclosed with walls, with doors opposite each other, 6 facing the north, and 6 the south, contiguous to one another, and the same exterior wall encloses them. It contains 2 kinds of rooms, some underground and some above ground over them, to the number of 3,000, 1,500 of each. The rooms above ground I myself went through and saw, and relate from personal inspection. But the underground rooms I only know from report, for the Egyptians who have charge of the building would, on no account, show me them, saying that there were the sepulchres of the kings who originally built this labyrinth, and of the sacred crocodiles. I can therefore only relate what I have learned by hearsay concerning the lower rooms, but the upper ones, which surpass all human works, I myself saw, for the passages through the corridors and the windings through the courts, from their great variety, presented 1,000 occasions of wonder as I passed from a court to the rooms, and from the rooms to halls, and to other corridors from the halls, and to other courts from the rooms. The roofs of all of these are of stone, and also are the walls, but the walls are full of sculpted figures. Each court is surrounded by a colonnade of white stone, closely fitted, and adjoining the extremity of the labyrinth is a pyramid, 40 orgae in height, on which large figures are carved, and a way to it has been made underground." End quote. Diodorus Siculus, another ancient Greek historian, further wrote of the labyrinth in his Bibliotheca Historica, roughly around the year 50 BCE. Quote, "When the king died, the government was recovered by Egyptians, and they appointed a native king Mendes, some who call Mares. Although he was responsible for no military achievements whatsoever, he did build himself what is called the labyrinth as a tomb, an edifice which is wonderful not so much for its size as for the inimitable skill with which it was built. For once in, it is impossible to find one's way out again without difficulty, unless one lights upon a guide who is perfectly acquainted with it. It is even said by some that Daedalus crossed over to Egypt, and in wonder at the skill shown in the building, built for Minos, king of Crete, a labyrinth like that in Egypt, in which, so the tale goes, the creature called the Minotaur was kept. Be that as it may, the Cretan labyrinth has completely disappeared, either through the destruction wrought by some ruler or through the ravages of time, but the Egyptian labyrinth remains absolutely perfect in its entire construction down to my time. And, seized with enthusiasm for this enterprise, they strove eagerly to surpass all their predecessors, while in respect of carving and other works of craftsmanship, they left no room for their successors to surpass them. For, when one had entered the sacred enclosure, one found a temple surrounded by columns, 40 to each side, and this building had a roof made of a single stone, carved with panels and richly adorned with excellent paintings. End quote. Strabo, another ancient Greek historian, also mentions the labyrinth in his works, written during the 1st century BCE. He talks of the immense size and complexity of the structure, also of its megalithic origins with huge single stones making up its construction. Strabo writes that, quote, hidden chambers which are long and many in number and have paths running through one another which twist and turn, so that no one can enter or leave any court without a guide. And the wonder of it is that the roofs of each chambers are made of single stones, and the width of the hidden chambers is spanned in the same way by monolithic beams of outstanding size, for nowhere is wood or any other material included. End quote. Pliny the Elder, a Roman author of the 1st century AD, also visited the labyrinth, and he wrote of it in his natural history books. Quote, let us speak also of labyrinths, quite the most extraordinary works on which men have spent their money, but not, as may be thought, figments of the imagination. There still exists, even now in Egypt, in the Heracleopolite Nome, the one which was built first, according to tradition, 3,600 years ago. At any rate, that Daedalus used this as the model for the labyrinth which he built in Crete is beyond doubt, but it is equally clear that he imitated only 1/100th part of it, which contains twisting paths and passages which advance and retreat, all impossible to negotiate. The Egyptian specimen, to my considerable astonishment, has its entrance and columns made of Parian marble, while the rest is of Aswan granite, such masses being put together as time itself cannot dissolve, even with the help of the Heracleopolitans, for they would have regarded the building with extraordinary hatred. It would be impossible to describe in detail the layout of that building and its individual parts, since it is divided into regions and administrative districts which are called nomes, each of the 21 nomes giving its name to one of the houses. A further reason is the fact that it also contains temples of all the gods of Egypt. Men are already weary with travelling when they reach that bewildering maze of paths. Indeed, there are also lofty upper rooms reached by ramps and porticos, from which one descends on stairways which have 90 steps each. Inside are columns of imperial porphyry, images of the gods, statues of kings, and representations of monsters. Certain of the halls are arranged in such way that as one throws open the door, there arises within a fearful noise of thunder. Moreover, one passes through most of them in darkness. There are again other massive buildings outside the walls of the labyrinth. They call them the wing. Then there are other subterranean chambers made by excavating galleries in the soil. End quote. There are several more mentions of this great labyrinth throughout recorded history, but at this point it's enough to say that we have several verified and trustworthy eyewitness accounts of it to verify that it both existed and must have been utterly awe-inspiring to look upon and explore. It's worth noting that Herodotus clearly states that the labyrinth exceeded the works of the Greeks and the achievements of the pyramids. Both the Great Pyramid at Giza and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which Herodotus mentions specifically in his account, are listed as two of the wonders of the ancient world, yet the majesty of the labyrinth is said to have exceeded them. There are a couple more accounts in more modern times that discuss the site from the late 17th century right up until the turn of the 19th century, including Napoleon's famous expedition, which also visited Hawara. However, it's not until Flinders Petrie established himself at the site that we first get any real modern evidence for the existence of the Great Labyrinth. It is true that Hawara had been extensively quarried and pillaged by the time Petrie arrived on site in 1888. It's why there's nothing left of the casing stones of the pyramid or of anything else, but given the depth of the labyrinth, much of what had been unearthed in the sands near the pyramid were the remains of the Greek-Roman structures that had been built on the surface above it. There is also a huge cemetery or necropolis established next to the pyramid, as was the habit of the later Egyptian and Ptolemaic periods, with tombs being dug on top of the labyrinth structure. This cemetery also extended to the area north of the pyramid. Petrie spent 2 seasons at Hawara, in 1888-89 and then again in 1910-1911. Although he was primarily interested in the pyramid there, he spent the majority of his time excavating in the area of the labyrinth. He did successfully find and map the internal chambers of the pyramid, chambers that are not accessible today due to the much higher level of the water table. I'll take a brief look at this pyramid and Petrie's work here as a follow-on video to this one. In 1889's Hawara, Biamu and Arsinoe, Petrie wrote the following about his investigation into the labyrinth. Quote, "This site, named from the village of Hawara nearby, was the principal ground for my excavations during 1888. I do not propose to state here any of the work which I did at the pyramid, as that is still incomplete, the chamber being found, but not yet entered. The most ancient subject for our attention, then, is the site of the labyrinth. By all authors, it is described as being close to a pyramid, and the only pyramid anywhere between the mouth of the canal and Arsinoe is that of Hawara. How far, then, will the remains at Hawara agree with the descriptions of the magnitude and importance of the labyrinth? We read of the enormous extent of the buildings, and of their exceeding in vastness all the temples of the Greeks put together, and that they even surpassed the pyramids. Of the beauty and magnificence of the work we cannot now judge, as almost every stone has long since been broken up and removed, but the extent of the area we can measure, as marked out by the immense bed of chips of fine white limestone, which lies on the south of the pyramid. Wherever we dig down, we find a bed of flat laid sand, or of beaten made of chips of stone rammed down, on which to lay the pavement and walls of some enormous building, and over that lie thousands of tons of fragments of the destroyed walls. On tracing these signs to their limits, it is found that they cover an area about 1,000 feet long and 800 feet broad. These mere figures will not signify readily to the mind the vast extent of construction, but when we compare it with the greatest of other Egyptian temples, it may be somewhat realized. On that space could be erected the great hall of Karnak, and all the successive temples adjoining it, and the great court and pylons of it, also the temple of Mut, and that of Khonsu, and that of Amenemhet III at Karnak, also the 2 great temples of Luxor, and still there would be room for the whole of the Ramesseum. In short, all of the temples on the east of Thebes, and one of the largest on the west bank, might be placed together in the one area of the ruins at Hawara. Here we certainly have a site worthy of the renown which the labyrinth acquired." End quote. Despite turning over a good portion of an acre worth of sand and examining every chip of stone, Petrie only found a few fragments of worked and inscribed granite at that site. These few pieces of pillared columns are likely the ones still viewable on the site today, giving only the barest clue to the majesty that must have once existed here. Importantly, however, Petrie here states the massive scale of the structure, some 1,000 feet long by 800 broad, or 304 meters by 244 meters in metric. It would be enough to fit 12 regulation-sized soccer fields in this space and still have room left over to spare. In another of Petrie's books, 1892's 10 Years Digging in Egypt, Petrie summarises the work he conducted and the mind-boggling scale of the remnants he found at Hawara. Quote, "Though the pyramid was the main object at Hawara, it was but a lesser part of my work there. On the south of the pyramid lay a wide mass of chips and fragments of building, which had long been generally identified with the celebrated labyrinth. Doubts, however, existed, mainly owing to Lepsius having considered the brick buildings on the site to have been part of the labyrinth. When I began to excavate, the result was soon plain, that the brick chambers were built on top of the ruins of a great stone structure, and hence they were only the houses of a village, as they had at first appeared to me to be. But beneath them, and far away over a vast area, the layers of stone chips were found, and so great was the mass that it was difficult to persuade visitors that the stratum was artificial and not a natural formation. Beneath all these fragments was a uniform smooth bed of beaten or plaster on which the pavement of the buildings had been laid, while the south side, where the canal had cut across the site, it could be seen how the chip stratum, about 6 feet thick, suddenly ceased at what had been the limits of the building. No trace of architectural arrangement could be found to help in identifying this great structure with the labyrinth, but the mere extent of it proved that it was far larger than any temple known in Egypt. All the temples of Karnak, of Luxor, and a few on the western side of Thebes might be placed together within the vast space of these buildings at Hawara. We know from Pliny and others how for centuries the labyrinth had been a great quarry for the whole district, and its destruction occupied such a body of masons that a small town existed there. All this information and the recorded position of it agrees so closely with what we can trace that no doubt can now remain regarding the position of one of the wonders of Egypt." End quote. Ultimately, Petrie had to rely on an analysis of the ancient accounts of the site in order to build a picture of what the labyrinth may have looked like. In his words, he described the structure as a collection of massive halls, courts and chambers, with columns in both the peristyle and hypostyle forms, each single court the equivalent of the massive temples like Luxor or Karnak that are visited by millions of tourists each year. Ultimately, his conclusion was that there is nothing left of the structure itself, that it had long since been quarried down to its roots, and only these ancient accounts of it remained. This then was the situation of the Great Labyrinth of ancient Egypt. It was thought to be lost to the sands of time and to the efficient quarrying of millennia, at least right up until the Mataha expedition of 2008. Mataha translates to labyrinth in Arabic, and this was a collaboration between the NRIAG, which is the National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics of Egypt, along with the Ghent University of Belgium, and Louis de Cordier, an artist and entrepreneur who, through his COSCO Foundation, funded the expedition. They worked in partnership with and with the permission of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, at the time headed by Dr. Zahi Hawass. Using a combination of techniques, including ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and very low-frequency electromagnetic mapping, they extensively surveyed 2 areas to the south of the pyramid on either side of the Barwabi Canal. The results of this scan are quite astonishing. In the first 4 meters of sand, there are the remains of the Ptolemaic and Roman-era structures. And at 5 meters, just below where is the current water table, we find the slabs that Petrie mentions, although he believed these were the remnants of the foundations of the labyrinth. It's only once we get to the deeper levels, 6 to 9 meters below the surface, that the other structures appear. You'll also notice the level of the current water table on this graph. It hasn't always been this high, it's only in the last 50 years or so that it's risen to this point. We can demonstrate this by returning to the pyramid here, which does have a megalithic descending passageway underneath the primitive mud brick structure that's on the surface. Flinders Petrie found this passageway and penetrated the chamber that this connects to, but today, only a short distance down this passage, we're stopped by the level of the water table. This isn't due to the canal, which was also there in Petrie's time, but rather due to an effect of the damming of the Nile River by the Aswan Dam. This dam removed the 9-month-long dry season that happens each year, and along with the increase of agricultural irrigation in the area, has contributed to the much higher level of salt water, which is now found only some 4 to 5 meters beneath the surface. You can see the effect this salty water is already having on the stone of this passageway, and that's the reason that action is really needed on this site. If we as a civilization wish to preserve and learn from the remains of such a mythical and epic structure as the labyrinth, we need to act, as it's currently being eroded and destroyed by the water table. A mapping of the results of the very low frequency testing at around 8 meters depths shows what can only be interpreted as structures, with the different colours representing different materials and also possibly voids, arranged in a grid-like pattern. These walls are said to have the characteristics of granite, which matches the historical accounts of the labyrinth. Surely then, such a discovery as this, the finding of a lost and mighty achievement of the ancient world, should have echoed around the globe. After all, only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world is still standing, the Great Pyramid, so strong evidence of something that is comparable to that achievement, if not exceeding it, something that has been lost to humanity for thousands of years. Surely this is worth the world's attention. This discovery was only met with resounding silence. Although the results of the expedition were communicated at a public lecture at Ghent University in 2008, and they were reported in the paywalled journal of the NRIAG, it was never ever made public. Why is this the case? In 2010, 2 years after this happened, a website was established by the expedition leader, and although it too is now gone from the internet, the information remains available for those that want to search for it, via the Cosco Foundation and also by the Wayback Machine, the Great Internet Archive. Quoting directly from this now extinct website, quote, "The conclusion of the Hawara Geophysics Survey is, however, still waiting to be internationally released by Dr. Zahi Hawass, the Secretary-General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt. Since the release of the scan results at the Ghent University public lecture, Dr. Zahi Hawass requested to stop communicating our results, intimidating the Mataha expedition team members with Egyptian national security sanctions. After 2 years of patience, we decided on June 2010 to oppose all cunning and deceit by posting the conclusions on the labyrinthofegypt.com website." End quote. While the labyrinthofegypt.com website doesn't actually exist any longer, you can still find the paper about the Mataha expedition at the Cosco Foundation website. Its conclusion, at least in part, reads, quote, "The Mataha expedition geophysic research confirms the presence of archaeological features at the labyrinth area south of the Hawara pyramid of Amenemhet III. These features, covering an underground area of several hectares, have the prominent signature of vertical walls on the geophysical results. The vertical walls, with an average thickness of several meters, are connected to shape nearly closed rooms, which are interpreted to be huge in number. Consequently, the Geophysics Survey, initiated with the permission of Dr. Zahi Hawass, the President of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, and conducted by the National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics from Helwan in Cairo, with the support of Ghent University, can now officially verify the occurrence of big parts of the labyrinth as described by the classic authors at the study area." End quote. The expedition papers go on to recommend further ground scanning surveys and the immediate initiation of action to begin to improve the drainage on the site and alleviate the corrosive salty water that is undoubtedly destroying the remnants of this structure right down to today. Once this has occurred, large-scale excavation could feasibly begin, and Hawara could progress from being a site that is rarely visited by tourists to one that becomes a major attraction for Egypt, right up there with Giza and Saqqara as just incredible examples of the ancient world. The story, however, doesn't end quite here, as in recent years there have been significant technological developments that have provided some additional proof of a structure deep beneath the sand at Hawara. In the last decade, the advent of space-based archaeology has come along in leaps and bounds. There are now various companies that tout their ability to make archaeological discoveries, find shipwrecks, map minefields, and much more by using satellite-based infrared and other ground-penetrating techniques. According to the Cosco Foundation, in 2015, the site was scanned by Merlin Burrows' land deep scan technology, and in 2017, another high-definition satellite scan survey was conducted by the Origin company. While both the results of these scans and of any real information on how these technologies work seems to be hard to come by, it does seem to be a legitimate field. And there are a couple of decent documentaries about the topic, even one narrated by Brendan Fraser on the Discovery Channel from around 7 years ago that's entitled Egypt, What Lies Beneath. This technology uses a combination of infrared scans along with high-definition photography, and it works only in fairly shallow depths, and then only in compatible mediums like dry desert sand. In 2015, Carmen Bulter, an independent researcher and filmmaker who produced the excellent Pyramid Code series of documentaries, appeared on a podcast with a remarkable claim that together with author and researcher Klaus Dohner, who had access to some form of space-based archaeology technology, they had mapped the Hawara area, and they had gained results that showed significant portions of the labyrinth, or of at least a large number of underground chambers and passages. These were apparently found in different layers at multiple different depths, and they were spread over a large area to the south of the pyramid. In this podcast, Dr. Bulter also claims that they have detected the presence of gold under the ground at Hawara. Now, I have tried to find more information on the specifics of these claims, both of the technology behind them and the methods used to achieve these results, but I really haven't been able to get anywhere. Klaus Dohner has multiple lectures that you can find online where he references this technology, usually in relation to the so-called Bosnian pyramids, and that his, quote, friend in Germany, end quote, is the person who developed this technology.
And a friend of mine, a German, he invented a very, very special technology where he can scan underground up to 3,200 meters. And we had already several checkings with him, and each time it was 100% sure and fixed.
In another lecture, Klaus Dohner states that this technology is further capable of reaching some 6,000 meters below the surface.
So a few months before, I started a cooperation with a very good friend of mine in Germany, who invented a new technology, a technology which makes us able to make scans through the earth down even up to 6,000 meters.
I will say that I'm quite skeptical of his claim that it is capable of peering down to 6 kilometers below the surface, which is orders of magnitude deeper than anything I've been able to find about ground-penetrating satellite technology. If these claims are indeed true, then this technology should be revolutionizing not just archaeology, but also mining, geology, and earth sciences in general. But I haven't really heard of that happening. Carmen Bulter's description of this technology didn't really help my understanding of it either.
But no one had done space archaeology on it. And so this is a completely new technology, a completely new way of being able to look through layers and go all the way down 6 kilometers down. And so Klaus Dohner and his company out of Germany and Vienna have developed this software application that goes on the live satellite feed, and it's working with quantum physics and standing columnar waves, so longitudinal waves and Maxwell equations. And that's all to say that it's similar to barcodes. So what you see, how the information on a barcode at the grocery store will give all the information about the product. It's similar, in the layman's terms, that's the simplest metaphor to go for in terms of how this works.
While these claims certainly very interesting, in the absence of any real data behind them or any information on the technology or scientific evidence for their results, I really can't vouch for their validity myself. Now, I'm not saying that they're wrong, just that extraordinary claims like these need extraordinary evidence in order to back them up. I'm certainly open to more information on these tests and on this technology. In fact, I'd really welcome it, as all I can find at this point is what they have said about it in these lectures and podcasts, most of them from around 5 years ago now. All I can really say about these claims and about this technology is that their results seem to be in line with the results of the Mataha expedition. That deep beneath the sands next to the pyramid exist the remains of the mythical Labyrinth of Egypt. If there is a paper out there or some more detailed description of this technology that any of you know about, please do let me know about it. I'd love to try and cover it on this channel. So after the Mataha expedition and the public lecture at Ghent University in October of 2008, all work at Hawara was shut down in 2009. Today, the site sits waiting, with its few caretakers, and the groundwater is slowly but surely eroding whatever there is left to find beneath the sand. Although the leadership of the renamed now Ministry of Antiquities has changed, there has only been a continuation of the deafening silence when it comes to the preservation of the labyrinth and Hawara in general. Per Louis de Cordier's Cosco Foundation, in 2018, permission was applied to the ministry to begin the Hawara Preservation Master Plan, created by a team from multiple universities and institutions around the world, in order to start the preservation of what could only be considered one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. I'm not even sure if funding is the issue here. I suspect it's a game of politics and power, in other words, typical human activity. As of the winter of 2019, no response has been received. Let's hope that this isn't the last mankind hears of the great lost labyrinth of Egypt. Both the legacy of our past and the generations of our future demand better from us. Thanks so much for watching. That's my take on the Great Labyrinth of Egypt. I know Hawara isn't the most visually impressive place to visit right now, but I think the picture that you can build up in your mind from all of those historical accounts of what that place once did look like, it's mind-blowing. As always, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everybody that does support the channel, be it through PayPal, Patreon, or Subscribestar. You guys are the reason that this channel even exists and can keep going forward. I do try to run it on the value for value model. It goes along the lines of that if you get some value from what I'm doing and you'd like to see it continue, please do consider returning some of that value back to me. It doesn't have to be through those mechanisms. There's a bunch of ways to do it. They're all outlined at unchartedx.com/support. I do have a whole bunch more planned. I've been going through a big infrastructure upgrade in the back end here. So until then, I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.